This video is on understanding the components of the word racism and its definition. Before I get into the definition itself, I just want to make a few points about how words work. First of all, a nuance point here is um, different. A word can have more than one definition, um, such as the word old. A meme can be a month old and be considered old. An old cat might be 10 years old, and a human is 100 years old, and that would be considered old. So these all are correct and proper usages of the word old, but they're not interchangeable. Um, a month old human is not considered old, right? So I don't think that needs more explanation. Another point here is a mask is defined as something along the lines of something that is used to block off something, um, and it could be a Halloween mask or a medical mask, which are two different types of masks, and they're not interchangeable, but both of them are included within the definition of the word mask. Another point here is that definitions of words change over time. For example, the word gay. It used to mean something like happy or joyful or jolly or whatever, but now no one would say that in a normal, um, you know, uh, conversation without expecting raised eyebrows or confusion. Um, and a last important point here is that some definitions can be incomplete and there can be missing components. So dictionaries do not define words. Their intention is to report on how words are used. Historically, dictionaries and most forms of media have been controlled by white men, and their perspective has influenced how words have been reported to be used within the media that they're using. Even if they are entirely well meaning, it can still, that influence will seep in. And this is not meant to knock specifically white men. It's just that historically they have had the power, and that's what happens when a group has the power. I believe that if, say, black women had had all the power, or as much power as white men had had throughout the centuries, you would have similar problems. Some different, some, you know, uh, but some would be the same. And they would certainly have, problems with seeing other perspective. Um, so it is important to realize that the marginalized groups and oppressed people have not had their voices heard throughout history. And so in our culture, including how we've used the word racism, it is incomplete. Um, Things are missing, things are not um, understood well because the people who produce media don't use those terminology, even though those voices are speaking, those marginalized groups, people are speaking out. They haven't always been heard in a wider context. So this video attempts to clarify on how the word has been used to mean different things and its whole definition combined. So the components of the word racism. First, what everybody understands here: racial superiority, which is the belief that different races possess distinct characteristics, abilities, or qualities, especially to distinguish them as inferior or superior to one another. And examples here: Nazis believing in a master race, racial eugenics, phrenology, scientific racism, and justification by state slave owners saying it's natural for blacks to be subjugated by whites. These are all the most extreme examples of racism, aka racial superiority, that everyone would agree upon and understand to be and recognize as racism. But that's not the only thing that racism is. Just like a Halloween mask is not the only thing that a mask is. Then there is racial bias. which is the definition here I'm giving is something along the lines of what is traditionally defined by white guys writing in dictionaries and used in the most mainstream media, which has traditionally been ran and everything by white men. Um, so the definition is an individual who consciously discriminates against people based on race and is intentionally mean to them. This would include KKK members, people who hate black people or shout out the word N-word, the N-word, people who would refuse to hire or rent to black people openly and on purpose. Again, these are examples that pretty much everyone would understand are racist and they would all agree upon and not be confused by. However, in recent years, the marginalized groups of people have been able to have their voice heard more. Progress has been made. It's not, racism is not gone, which is why we're still discussing it. But so let's go on to the other components of racism. A major component is systemic racism. So basically, it's not just an individual who can be racist, but a whole structure of like a company or a country can be racist, and that the system, the laws within it and stuff. So the definition is a system which discriminates against people based on race, regardless of if this discrimination is accidental, and regardless of if the people discriminating are aware of the discrimination. So, on that last point about being aware of their discrimination, for example, if someone is a landlord renting to people and they are taking applications and they come across a black couple who wants to rent to them, who wants a place to rent, they may not view themselves as racist and they may not, have any kind of rule against renting to black people or something, but they can still be biased against those other races, and that bias can subconsciously seep into what they do, and that would still be racism. I would say it's not as bad of racism in the sense that their intention is not bad, but the result can be just as bad as intentional racism, and perhaps even worse in some cases. So I just want to give a few examples of systemic racism real quick. The example I gave of the landlord is not an example of systemic racism necessarily. That's just an example of how a person would not be aware of it. So the examples are various laws and structures which are set up to have the result, which have the result, intentional or not, of disadvantaging a minority group. So this would be redlining, rent discrimination, and discrimination by race in AI. I'm not going to clarify those things now because I'm going to go into those in a future video. I will give one scenario which sets up systemic racism nicely here. Or not nicely in the case. If a minority is arrested, charged, and sentenced to jail, and is covered in the media, the police, the judge, the jury, the lawyer, the journalists, etc., are all likely to be white, aka not of their race, partially because there are more white people in America, just as a percentage, around 60% or so. But beyond that, systemic racism has led to white people in holding most positions of power, even beyond their population percentage. So, as opposed to this minority being arrested, if a white person is arrested, their likelihood is that they're going to have people of their own race being in control of their of the world's perception of them, and also of what happens to them, like they're being judged in the jury and all of that. And so if any one of those myriad of people are racist and biased against them, even unintentionally, then it can have disastrous results for them. And we see that in the statistics, which again I will not cover here because I get into in a future video. And lastly, um, merging all those components of racism, um, we can define racism to include all forms of racism, just like a mask would include a medical mask and a Halloween mask. So this definition is including the more recent marginalized and oppressed people speaking out and being heard to encompass all forms of racism. And that definition is an individual or group which consciously or unconsciously discriminates against people based on race, even if this discrimination is not intended and or is accidental. So you don't have to do it on purpose. You don't have to intend to do it. You don't have to know you are doing it. And it can be a group of people or an individual. And it's all racism. So understanding that can clarify a lot of misconceptions and miscommunications. Any and all examples of what I've included are a form of racism. And if you're wishing to have a genuine, mature, honest dialogue about racism with someone, it is necessary to recognize words are a tool to communicate and should be used as such. Here are the four components of racism. The first three are the components, and the last one is the combination. And just a couple points about conversations about racism. People get defensive about the word racism because they have their own definition of the word, or what they think of as the definition of the word, or what they include in the definition. And they may not be aware of and understand the other parts of racism. And so if someone says something is racist or they are racist, they may assume that they are using that definition to describe them, and they get defensive because they think, oh, well, I'm not like a KKK member, I'm not racist. And they think that person is calling them like that type of racism, and they get defensive. So it's important to, in an honest dialogue, two people can switch between definitions after clarifying what the definitions are, because ultimately words are just sounds or written text that are used to note a concept, which is abstract. It's not like a sound. A concept is not a sound or whatever, or a written word. So if you have if there's different concepts about racism, you can talk about each of them. You don't have to demand everyone use a single concept, because doing that can be evasive. As long as everyone is working together to communicate clearly, then you can switch between concepts or different definitions of a word, and everyone's voice can be heard, everyone's thoughts can be shared and communicated, and deeper understanding can be had by everyone without being evasive. So hopefully that's been helpful. I'm interested in any concepts, or excuse me, anything I left out, any ideas you have, or concepts of racism that I left out, or just any comments in general. Thank you.